Vamos iniciar então a terceira sessão, a segunda sessão do dia. We start with the second section of the day, a Benjaminian one. The title of this panel will be Critique of Violence. It's an important book for our discussions. I have the pleasure to share a lecture with Alexia about this subtopic. This Benjamin's book was one of the most important books we had during the lectures. But let me introduce you the speaker, the three speakers of this panel. I will start with Alexia, Professor Alexia Bretas. She is professor at the Federal University of ABC. She has a master's degree and a doctorate in philosophy from the University of São Paulo, and a postdoctoral degree in literary theory from Unicamp, and a research stays at Freie Universität Berlin, Université Paris 8. She's the author of the books The Constellation of the Dream, de Walter Benjamin, A Constelação dos Sonhos, de Walter Benjamin, sobre o romance de artista, do romance de artista, a dimensão estética, a permanência da arte, Marcuse e as aporias da modernidade estética, Fantasmagoria da modernidade, Fantasmagoria of modernity. She's member of the Philosophy and Gender Work Group of the National Association of Graduate Students in Philosophy, of the Brazilian Network of Women Philosophers, and of the Esperança Garcia Gender Studies Center, and of the Nexus Network, Critical Theory and Interdisciplinary Research. So then we have Sami, Professor Sami. He is interim professor at the Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design, and a founding member of the Bayreuth Institute of Critical Analysis and Research. His publications include a co-editorship of the volume Critique, the States of Form, and the authorship of the book Theology Only in Spain, Walter Benjamin's Seven Christianity, Theology Without End, Walter Benjamin's Dislocation of the Messiah. And finally, we have Professor Robespierre, Oliveira. He is PhD with a thesis on Marcuse, Critical Theory and Philosophy. He was a postdoctoral visiting professor at SUNY. He has chapters published in books, translations of Herbert Marcuse in Portuguese, including one mentioned there, and a book called O Papel da Filosofia na Teoria Crítica de Herbert Marcuse, The Role of Philosophy in Marcuse's Critical Theory. He continues to dedicate his research to Marcuse and other fifth-generation members of the Frankfurt School. He is a professor of philosophy, undergraduation and graduation at the Universidade Estadual de Maringá, Brazil. He is a member of the International Herbert Marcuse Society and participates of the group of research, critical theory and education, pesquisa teoria crítica e educação. So we will start with Alexia, Professor Alexia. Sorry, we are close. Professor Alexia, with the title Ruin 22, Allegories of Mythical Violence in the Global South.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here again with the Extimacies group and the European group discussing critical theory in the Global South. And I will try to take as a starting point the Benjamin's text toward the critical violence, and I will try to read the work of Adriana Varejão as an allegory of Benjaminian concept of mythical violence. That's the the abstract of my presentation, and well, we can discuss any topics after my presentation. And I hope you appreciate the visual presentation, because especially in regard to Adriana Varejão, the work of Adriana Varejão, I guess it will be very useful. The article towards a critic, part of this presentation I've already presented in Stellenbosch, and I'm so glad to continue this investigation, bringing the contribution of Brazilian artist Adriana Varejão to think the decolonial perspective on Benjaminian facts. The article towards a critic of violence was written by Dr. Benjamin in 1921 to reflect on the relationship between law and justice, as well as the opposition between power as violence and violence as power, exemplified by the existence of law and the state, and by the revolutionary strike, respectively. In this sense, the very notion of criticism, already present in the title of the essay, applies not exactly to an ethical political position identified as pacifist or non-violent, but to the effort we might call Kantian to demarcate limits and conditions of possibility for a divine or revolutionary justice beyond the legal system itself. To this end, the author makes a fundamental distinction between two major types of violence: the one that institutes or creates the law, and the one that maintains or preserves the law. Such methodical position will be of great importance for understanding some of the main ideas mobilized in this writing, inspired by George Sorel's reflections on violence, but also by Jewish theology and Herman Cohen's ethics of a pure will. The core of this dialectics appears already in the semantic constitution of the German word Gewalt itself. If on one hand, the first meaning of the term refers to potestas, that is, to power and political domination, as for example in the noun Staatsgewalt, authority or state power. On the other hand, it refers, in everyday use, to the excess of force that usually circumscribes the exercise of power as violence, as in the case of the compound word Vergewaltigung. Great. In order to discuss the question of the means and ends of power violence, Benjamin compared the position assumed by the defenders of natural law and the advocates of a positive law. According to the ideological conception that fostered Jacobin terror in the French Revolution, the application of violent means for fair ends is not and has never been a problem, since according to this perspective, violence is not something to be avoided, but used as a kind of raw material or resource of nature, always available to insurgents instead, except when misused to achieve unfair ends. In this antithesis to natural law, however, Benjamin opposes the positive law, according to which violence is not perceived as a natural product, but rather as a result of historical development exclusively. Thus, while the former seeks to justify the means by the justice of ends, the
the latter endeavors to guarantee the justice of the ends by the justification of the means. Benjamin, however, goes further, seeking to reframe his theory of justice outside the realm of legality, at a point outside the law itself. For him, always violent, whether positive or natural. When violence is not, I quote Benjamin, when violence is not in the hands of the established law, whatever it may be, it threatens it dangerously, not for the purpose it seeks to achieve, but for its mere existence outside the law. He writes, to exemplify his arguments with concrete cases, Benjamin mentions the workers' strike, taking the organized working class as the only subject beyond the state capable of exercising the right to violence. The philosopher draws attention to the ambivalences inherent in such a concession. For the right to strike is not absolute or unconditional, but it's accepted only as a right not to act, that is, to abstain or to break violent labor relations by the employer. Moreover, he also refers to another two kinds of strikes, the political strike, in which power only shifts from one privileged group to another, and doctor strike, which turned out to be an abject, unscrupulous, and immoral use of violence against life, thereby delivered to abandonment. In contrast to such actions, the author refers to the revolutionary general strike, which from the point of view of the law has far more drastic consequences for society, as it poses a great danger to the existence and stability of the rule of law itself. Reason why? It is usually treated not as a right, but as an abuse to be contained by emergency decrees promulgated to neutralize its threat and thus restore normality and social order. Benjamin states, as paradoxical as it may seem at first glance, even behavior assumed in the exercise of a right must, under certain circumstances, be characterized as violence. In other words, the law reacts to strikers understood as practicing violence with more violence. And at this point, it resembles the right of war itself, taken by the author as an archetypical and original form of all immediate or predatory violence driven by natural ends. As it turns out, the position of this essay clashes with the position taken by poorly educated liberals, moderate socialists, or childish anarchists, as Benjamin admits with Bolsheviks and trade unionists, that the violence of the revolutionary general strike is the only one in condition to, at the same time, ground and modify the relations of law, even though from the point of view of ethics and justice, it may seem controversial or even abusive. In any case, one of the most recognized contributions from toward the critic of violence is the proposed distinction between law-setting violence, such as war or workers' strike, and law-maintaining violence, as compulsory service military, for example. In both cases, it refers to what the author designates as mythic violence, and illustrates with episodes narrating the punishments of the gods in Greek mythology, directed in particular at the figures of Niobe, who is the victim of a law-creating violence, and Prometheus, the target of violence perpetrated to preserve the Olympic law. To such forms of violence, the author opposes another, which is considered pure, immediate, and divine, since it would be the only one capable of surpassing the very genealogy of law, understood by Benjamin as a privilege or an exclusive prerogative of the powerful. He writes, if mythic violence is law-setter, divine violence is law-destroying. If the first establishes borders, the second annihilates without limits. It is therefore in the name of the so-called divine violence of the revolutionary general strike and against the mythical violence of state and law that Benjamin will clash with activists and pacifists defending the sacredness of life thesis, be it applied to all animal and even plant life or restricted to human life. Theorists of radical pacifism and homosexual rights, Kurt Wheeler, for example, states, if I do not kill, I will never establish the universal kingdom of justice. So reasons the intellectual terrorists. But we proclaim that above happiness and the justice of an existence is existence itself. According to Benjamin, in addition to being false, such a view would be ignoble on the assumption that existence itself could have a higher value than the fair existence. I quote Benjamin, For man is not reduced to the mere life of man, not to the mere life in himself, nor to any of his other states and qualities, even to the uniqueness of his physical person. The more sacred is man, or also that life in him, which is identical in earthly life, death, and the continuation of life, the less are his states, his corporeal life, vulnerable to other men. By questioning the thesis that attributes to human life a sacred content, Benjamin offers elements for Agamben to develop much later his famous theory of sovereign power in the light of the notion of naked or bare life embodied in the figure of Homo sapiens. In any case, even in the Benjaminian text, the dialectics between the law-creating violence and the law-holding violence culminates, after all, in a true aporia, which can only be surpassed by the pure revolutionary violence as foreshadowing a new historical age. I quote Benjamin. Law-keeping violence ends in itself through the repression of enemy counter-violences, indirectly weakening over time the law-making violence it represents. This lasts until such time as a new or previously repressed violence overcomes the hitherto law-establishing violence, thus founding a new right for a further decline. It is in the breaking of this magically bound circle in the mythical forms of law, in the destitution of law and the violence upon which it depends, that which ultimately depend on it, in the destitution of state violence, that a new historical era is founded. The fact that Benjamin ended the essay towards a critic of violence by highlighting the casual relationship between the destitution of state power and the advent of a new historical age is certainly not fortuitous. In the 1920s, in the face of the early years of the Weimar Republic, the author warns of the risk that erasing awareness of the latent existence of violence in the constitution of legal institutions precipitates its own decay, which may in fact have contributed to the Nazi coup via the famous Article 48. In other words, a legal expedient in charge of maintaining the law is paradoxically responsible for its own abolition. Quite significantly, Benjamin's essay does not seem to attach any special value to mere natural life, a mera vida, or, as he said, to corporeal life, vulnerable to other men. This becomes very clear when he defends the superiority of divine violence over mythical violence in light of the castigation of the gang of Korah. Such a biblical episode is portrayed in Numbers 16 and chronicles God's punishment against a group of Levites who rebelled against Moses' authority over the congregation of Israel. By being swallowed alive into the abyss, with all their goods and possessions, the 250 insurgents were punished for their sins, but also atoned for by the wrath of God, and henceforth remembered and respected as saints, so that such uprisings do not occur against in the future. Thus, according to Benjamin, against the mythical violence of the state and the law, divine violence acts in a pure and non-bloody way, which highlights the purifying character of this essentially annihilating modality of violence. Benjamin compares, I quote him, mythical violence is bloody violence executed in its own favor against mere life. Divine and pure violence is executed against all life in favor of the living. The first requires sacrifices, the second accepts them. Then I will start with the work of Adriana Varejão, and I'll try to take Benjamin's concept of mythical violence and divine violence to reflect upon her ruins. And other works, of course. The exhibition Sutures, Fissures, Ruins by Adriana Varejão has been on display at Pinacoteca de São Paulo in 2022, but it's not there even, just until August. Conceived to present the artist's trajectory over 35 years, the exhibition was guided by a strongly decolonial and anti-racist perspective, featuring works such as Lobo Woman's Map, colonial self-portraits, Bastard Son, and Povo, as well as the iconic incarnated ruins. While the cartography representations carry an immense open wound torn over the African continent, the self-portraits bring several illustrations of racialized people, ordered, numbered, and classified according to their respective physiognomic and pigmentations characteristics. Already alluding to a mestiçagem, the enormous variety of the skin tones found in Brazil, the word Povo shows a wooden case with 32 tubes of paint, each one labeled with the name and the corresponding chromatic tint. Now I may have some problem with the translation of the name of the colors. Some of them got very funny. Fogoyó, these are the names of the colors of the skin, the tones of skin. Fogoyó, white, dirty, pretty dark, sulfured, luscious white, dark tiger, coffee with milk, navy blue, white, wood color, chocolate, donkey when runs, olish, cloudy, sunburned, dark, mulatto, wax, dark, light white, Bahian, cabocla, dark-haired, Galician, firm color, mestiço, pale, jumbo brunette, not fair, half black, light brown, sapecada. No translation available. These translations were made by Google Translate. The burro fugido, donkey that runs. Without a doubt, the most emblematic works in the exhibition are the so-called ruins. Brazilian's ruin, Ruin 22, beef jerky Porto ruin. Beef jerky is a kind of meat, charque. Beef jerky Porto ruin, beef jerky Santa Cruz ruin, and Tavaleira ruin 1 and 2. Displayed in the Pinacoteca's octagon, they emphasize the ruinous character of the building itself, built to be a marble factory, which however was never completed, as can be seen from the exposed bricks and the open structure. Part of Adriana's work for more than 30 years, the ruins make use of flesh or meat, whether animal or human, as raw material for the constructions of beams, pillars or pillars, and other support devices covered in tiles, sometimes Portuguese, sometimes inspired by the patterns of Tavaleira, poblana ceramics, a Mexican tradition that combines indigenous techniques with other brought by Spanish colonizers. Jochen Voss observes, all the artist's ruins are marked by the contradiction between something that seems solid and cold on one side and soft and warm on the other. They are equally repulsive and extremely attractive. They are paintings in space made to be seen from all angles. The question surfaces as we see them and reveal what they may be hiding. There are ruins made of meat, suggesting many possible readings about colonial heritage, physical work, handcrafts, constructive traditions and exploitations, or even about destruction and destruction, about regionality and eroticism. End of the quote. These contradictions are part of our own national history, our Brazilian history, built on a pile of ruined bodies. By the way, Hortense Spiller's caveat fits here. She says, I would make a distinction between body and flesh, or meat, I guess it's flesh, and would impose the distinction as central between captive and freed subject positions. In this sense, before the body, there is the flesh, that zero degree of social conceptualization that does not escape dissimulating under the brush of discourse or the reflections of iconography. Thus, we could take the ruins of Adriana Varejão and Brazil's ruin in particular as the epitome par excellence of the history of Brazil, constituted from apparently solid structures and European aesthetics, at the core of which are found fragments of bodies of unidentified origin, sectioned, amalgamated, and compressed as if they had never lived. As Elvira Dias Benitez explains, flesh for the author, for Hortense Spillers, is a primary narrative, that which precedes the body, which for enslaved Black or indigenous people in captivity has become an archive of violation and torture, hieroglyphs, brutal effects on tissue, muscle, and skin. Regarding such incarnation of colonial violence in stable bodies and structures destined to last, Johnny Lima evokes the permanence of barbarism in the very core of the so-called civilized societies, as we read in one of Benjamin's best-known theses. The curator states, in the absence of words, carnage history becomes present as a monument that, despite leaving its marks, does not celebrate and serves as a physical memory in the face of destruction. And now my conclusion. If Walter Benjamin is right when he says that allegories are in the realm of thoughts what ruins are in the realm of things. We could read the paintings, sculptures, and installations of Adriana Varejão as allegories, that is, as expressions of a visual language, certainly precarious, through which historical traumas and violence could be translated and eventually overcome, never forgotten. For they constitute the monuments of a barbarism that is perpetuated in reverse of the history of the winners as its support structure. With a solid and cold exterior and a soft and warm interior, like the ruins of tiles and meat of Adriana Varejão. In Benjaminian terms, they were produced according to a process that seen on one side seems pure and non-bloody, and on the other extremely impure and bloody. That is, from the point of view of the European colonizers, the global north, the monuments appear to be beautiful, homogeneous, and stable, like the traditional Portuguese tiles. However, seen from another perspective, from the global south, they reveal their other face, the one that lies under the shining surface and brings the viscera of animal and human lives violently destroyed in the name of a monumental history erected under the auspices of a founding myth that naturalizes the racial violence by placing the Portuguese blood in a position to guide the indigenous and black races towards fulfilling the call of the state of Brazil. Therefore, according to the distinctions proposed by Walter Benjamin between mythical violence and divine violence, we could conclude by saying that for the law of the settlers, the violence required for the consolidation of a colonial order was carried out according to the principles of divine violence, since it was perpetuated with endorsement of the notion of just war based on the Holy Scriptures. From the point of view of indigenous peoples and enslaved black people, though, it is a manifestation of mythical violence, since it occurred only to create and preserve law and justice for white people in the global north through genocidal practices of corporal violence and radically impure and bloody extermination against mere life or mere life. Which raises the question of who the storyteller is, because according to their position as a subject, violence will be represented as barbaric or civilized, fair or unfair, human or inhumane. Ultimately, this is the lesson that Adriana Varejão, the ruins of Adriana Varejão, read as allegories of decolonial violence, teach us today. Thank you.
Just to pass the word for a second. Because I believe some of you will shout the
longer calls, that's nice to have.
So, Sami Khatib will present Marcuse, Benjamin, and the question of Mythical, or violence and non-violence.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and good afternoon also from my side. Thank you, Silvio, for organizing this, and thank you, Jennifer. There you are. And also the Extimacies research group, that whose activities I was happy to follow from the beginning of when it was established. In this paper, it's actually a reworking of an earlier essay on Benjamin's essay on the critique of violence. I try to somehow but bring into, let's say, in a political constellation, the otherwise maybe more philosophical observation that Benjamin had on violence. First of all, I'm very thankful that you already gave an introduction, perfect introduction to the essay, so it was much more philologically precise what you did. Thank you so much. So I can actually skip a couple of slides probably. Okay, but let's see. I start with the first slide. On the morning of December the 2nd, 1859, a couple of hours before his execution, John Brown, the defeated American abolitionists, wrote, and that is also, it's not the handwriting, but it's the note that was transcribed for him by his followers. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Brown was hanged to death, convicted by a jury and society that was determined to defend slavery as a system of racist supremacy and exploitation. Against this form of legalized violence, John Brown took up arms and organized a failed slave rebellion in Jefferson County, West Virginia, only a couple of years before the American Civil War started, which would eventually abolish slavery and install a capitalist wage system of exploitation with racialized layers of oppression instead. Looking at the history of 20th century American, European, and world history, John Brown's prophecy holds true. The crimes of this guilty land, of these guilty lands of global capitalism, as we might add, will never be purged away without bloodshed. Spilling blood, counter-violence seem unavoidable. However, such bloodshed can never undo the original violence of the ongoing counter-revolution. More than 100 years later, in 1965, shortly before his assassination, American revolutionary Malcolm X famously addressed his American audience with a reference to John Brown. That quote, I think we might even have that quote. That should be up there, yeah, exactly. This is Malcolm X. I don't go for non-violent white liberals. If you are for me and my problems, when I say me, I mean us, our people, then you have to be willing to do as old John Brown did. In another speech, he criticized attempts to portray John Brown as not as a delusional fanatic. Moreover, Malcolm X takes the historical picture of John Brown as a litmus test to identify the historiography of the oppressor, of Victor's history, Siegergeschichte, as Walter Benjamin would have put. Not surprisingly, to liberal bourgeois historiography, a figure like John Brown, a faithful Christian evangelical, you might even want to say this word today, he was a faithful Christian evangelical who took up arms against the violence of oppressors, appears as a religious fanatic, if you want a Christian jihadi. Putting the question of fanaticism and religion aside, in this paper, I examined the meta-religious political implication of Brown's call to arms. Is there a political strategy to work through the historical layers of guilt and violence in order to undo the latter? As we already know from early Frankfurt School, the dialectics of violence, revolution, and counter-revolution cannot be analyzed in abstract terms. Calling for a concrete political analysis and refraining from gratuitous ex post judgments, Herbert Marcuse in Counterrevolution and Revolt wrote, this is the longer quote, martyrs have rarely helped the political cause. Revolutionary suicide remains suicide. And yet, it would be self-righteous indifference to say that the revolutionary ought to live rather than to die for the revolution, an insult to the communards of all times. Where the establishment proclaims its professional killers as heroes and its rebelling victims as criminals, it is hard to save the idea of heroism for the other side. The desperate act, doomed to failure, may for a brief moment tear the veil of justice and expose the faces of brutal suppression. It may arouse the conscience of the neutrals. It may reveal hidden cruelties and lies. Only he who commits the desperate act can judge whether the price he is bound to pay is too high in terms of his own cause as a common cause. Any generalization would be ambivalent, nay, profoundly unjust. It would condemn the victims of the system to the prolonged agony of waiting, to prolonged suffering. End of quote. These lines were written in 1972, as you know, so after the wave of political assassinations that also killed Malcolm X in 1965. With Marcuse, we can conclude that the time of waiting and prolonged suffering belongs to the temporal order of reformism and the social democratic concept of history that Walter Benjamin, in his last reflections from 1940, criticized. I think that is the next slide. Yes. Once the classless society has been, this is Walter Benjamin, has been defined as an infinite task, you hear the Kantian vocabulary, neo-Kantian. The empty and homogeneous time was transformed into an anteroom, so to speak, in which one could wait for the emergence of the revolutionary situation with more or less equanimity. In reality, there is not a moment that would not carry with it its revolutionary chance, provided only that it is defined in a specific way, namely as the chance for a completely new resolution of a completely new task. For the revolutionary thinker, the peculiar revolutionary chance offered by every historical moment gets its warrant from the political situation. Of course, Benjamin's and Marcuse's historical perspectives differ a lot. Both, however, would agree that the task of defining the revolutionary chance of one's own age also necessitates the definition and critique of its counter-revolutionary moments. Reflecting on the failure of the student revolt in the US and Europe, Marcuse affirmed the existence of revolutionary chances, even in an age of counter-revolution. Distinction must be made, Marcuse, between violence and revolutionary force. In the counter-revolutionary situation of today, violence is the weapon of the establishment. It operates everywhere in the institutions and organizations, in work, in fun, on the streets and highways, and in the air. In contrast, the revolutionary force, which is destined to terminate this violence, does not exist today. Revolutionary force would be the action of masses or classes capable of subverting the established system in order to build a socialist society. Obviously, such a distinction hinges on the historical political analysis of a revolutionary situation and the discrimination between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces, the state and its legalized violence. Such a determination is internal to the shifting ground of the term violence itself. An abstract concept of violence would be flawed, and thus any definition derived from such a term be reactionary and counter-revolutionary. To this degree, I actually agree to Vladimir's paper yesterday. Philosophers should really do not try to give us a philosophy of violence. It's nonsense, especially when it is derived from abstract thinking. In other words, the question of revolution and the one of violence are not external to each other, as though dealing with discrete factors, but shape the very concept of revolution and counter-revolution. Of course, one could object that the various political meanings of violence, force, power, and authority overlap and fluctuate in a way that any attempt to clarify the relation of revolution and violence is deemed to produce a tautology, and in the end, an end in only one-sided apologies for violence, repeating the old saying that one's freedom fighter is the other's terrorist. Against such commonplace assertions, I would like to take a step back and looking at the short history of the modern term violence and Benjamin's attempt to come up with a relational concept of violence. And we've heard already a lot on that, thanks to the talk before. So as Etienne Balibar noted, there are different political economic traditions and languages that theorize the term violence, and I quote you from an earlier essay by Balibar. In German, the word Gewalt, coming from Waltan, has a more extensive meaning than its equivalents in other European languages. Violence or violenza or pouvoir, potere, power, or equally suitable to translate Macht or even Herrschaft, depending on the context. These different meanings are not only relevant from a philological but also conceptual point of view. The term Gewalt, here I quote again Balibar, thus contains an intrinsic ambiguity. It refers at the same time to the negation of law or justice and to their realization or the assumption of responsibility for them by an institution. If you read actually this essay, you're not so surprised about that Benjamin already earlier on precisely distinguished between that ambiguity as law putting or law setting or law constituting, law making violence on the one hand, and the other one would be law preserving violence. But maybe later again, because you have just heard the terminology. In the history of revolutionary Marxism, this was actually Georges Sorel, you already heard the name, a self-acclaimed Marxist and revolutionary syndicalist who in 1906 introduced a theoretical distinction of the term violence, revealing the latter's asymmetric ambiguity. Sorel opposes two seemingly parallel French terms, actually Latin terms, violence against force. Violence is on the side of the revolt against the force of authority and state power. So contrary to Marcuse's later vocabulary and distinction of counter-revolutionary violence and revolutionary forces, for Sorel, violence is revolutionary. It is an immediate expression of the proletarian masses against intellectualized, technically and administratively mediated force exercised by the state and capital owners. The social order of force and the violent resistance of the exploited masses, however, are not symmetrical. Sorel's distinction between force and violence allows him to give full theoretical political weight to the basic asymmetry of systemic violence in capitalist societies. Instead of playing violence and counter-violence against each other as a kind of zero-sum game, as liberals would have it, Sorel aims at abolishing the state and its forces through violent action against which the state cannot defend itself. The Sorelian myth of the revolutionary syndicalist or proletarian general strike serves this role, according to Sorel. Instead of appealing to the state, accepting its force and authority, and demanding reforms, proletarian general strike calls for more. As the forces of the state and violence of the revolution are fundamentally different, so the political and proletarian general strike are diametrically opposed to one another. This is Sorel, 1906. Without going further into detail of Sorel's otherwise more intricate argument, this differentiation between force and violence sheds light on the asymmetric ambiguity of violence that modern political theory, in one way or another, attempted to contain. Violence, however, is not one-sided or exclusive. Cannot be attributed to one institution, social group, political agent, or historical epoch. Of course, also Hannah Arendt here is to be mentioned as one of the more famous failures to achieve such a definition of violence, of distinction between violence is apolitical, then you have force, and then you have power, and so on. Ultimately, Sorel's réflexions sur la violence remain blind to the inherent dialectics of proletarian violence and state force. How can violent revolts transform themselves into state forces, and in return, how does the state rely on the exceptional violence inherent to the functioning of its own so-called security forces? Despite its radical rhetoric, Sorel's criticism of the state falls short in producing a materialist insight into the inner relationship, transition and reversal of the two notions that he attempted to separate, violence and force. In other words, the dialectics of violence does not simply refer to a conceptual ambiguity, but also to a dialectical reversal of the extremes. Violent acts bear the seeds of their opposite and vice versa. Moreover, the dialectics of violence is asymmetric, epistemologically attached to a subjective dimension of violence that only appears as such, as this subjective dimension, when held against the background of objective violence, as Slavoj Žižek points out. The catch is that, as Žižek, that subjective and objective violence cannot be perceived from the same standpoint. Subjective violence is experienced as such against the background of a non-violent zero level. It is seen as a perturbation of the normal, peaceful state of things. However, objective violence is precisely the violence inherent to this normal state of things. Objective violence is invisible since it sustains the very zero level standard against which we perceive something as subjectively violent. So subjectively violent is also that which disturbs the objective functioning of everyday violence, we call systemic violence, even though it might not be perceived as such. These different standpoints toward violence can coincide, but are not identical with the distinction of revolution and counter-revolution, the violence of the proletariat and the forces of the state. If we combine Žižek's insight with Benjamin's dictum, according to which we have to grasp, with Benjamin, the state of exceptional emergence, Ausnahmezustand, in which we live not as the exception but the rule, then we can also perceive the subjective violence of the state as violent objectivity, a kind of an extremism of the everyday. I mean, it would be one of the possible definitions of fascism. In the history of critical theory, it was Benjamin who firstly theorized the dialectics and asymmetry of violence that is present in the German term Gewalt. Benjamin's earlier, we have heard about the essay already, Pre-Marx's Essay zur Kritik der Gewalt, published in 1921, examines the intrinsic ambiguity that violence acquires in the modern state and its policy, institutions, and jurisdiction, exposing a latent dialectic or a unity of opposite that is a constituent element of politics. Again, this is quoted by Maringá. Benjamin is very aware of the contradictory meanings of Gewalt when reflecting on the political situation shortly after the failed German Revolution of 1918-19 and in the light of communist and anarcho-syndicalist uprisings in various German regions. Due to its intrinsic ambiguity, the problem of Gewalt is inherent to all legal and moral questions, as the opening passage of Benjamin's essay suggests. In a quote, the task of a critique of violence can be summarized as that of expounding its relation to law and justice. For a cause, however effective, becomes violent in the precise sense of the word only when it intervenes into moral actions. Moral relations. An action can only assume the setup of violence, follow Benjamin's statement, in the strict sense, once it stands in such a relation, in a moral relation, sittliche, ethical life. Benjamin gives no essentialist definition of Gewalt. It remains a relational concept which can only be presented or defined and criticized from within these historical relations and their respective polarizations. Of course, if you know the term, and also Badibar makes this clear, Gewalt means both, no? That is, and state power, it can also be the violence that overthrows the power. It's precisely the two dimensions of violence that Sorel tried to map on force and violence. So it means authority, violence, power, force, and so on. So but this is not because German language is just too unprecise. Actually, it is true to the very ambiguity in dialectics the term has. So it is used in this way. In the usage of that, in the relational meaning of violence, I think you get the meaning much better. So that's why I said earlier, the definition of violence, especially an abstract one, is reactionary from the very beginning. It's a political move to delegitimize a certain faction, but has no semantic meaning beyond that. It is a relational concept. That's why I said also earlier, revolutionary situation and violence, they're basic, it's a tautology. You have to, both have to be enacted and concretized, otherwise it's just abstract talk of philosophers, it's useless. According to Benjamin's essay, Gewalt, be it institutionalized or extra-legal, can only be criticized historically and immanently. So that means in these relations, in this relational network, which he otherwise has called mythic violence, like the constitutive spurious cycle of law constituting or law making violence and law preserving violence. Such a critique can expose the ambiguity of this term. And as Werner Hamacher argues, every positing of violence and its institutionalization already implies its reversal, as the German term Gewalt says. For every positing or Setzung requires its enforcement against another act of positing and instituting. Hence, the logic of positing is always threatened by acts of counter-positing. Within the paradigm of the state, Benjamin distinguishes the two forms of violence we already heard about, so I can skip actually a bit. So the one that mutually deconstruct each other, either law-making or law-preserving violence. The mythic, also one can ask, why does Benjamin call it mythic violence? So the mythic, or you can translate it as fateful character of violence, is rooted in this intrinsic dialectic, which leads into a totalizing circular logic. Any law-destroying act results in a new positing of law, which against violently tries to preserve itself, ad infinitum. For Benjamin, this cycle, fateful cycle, of overcoming law by re-establishing it is a clear indicator that there's something fundamentally rotten in the law, as he says. And this rottenness, Morsch, he says in German, appears as ambiguity for every action of law enforcement blurs the line between law-preserving and law-making violence. So in the sphere of direct state repression, we talk here about police force especially, law-preserving force and law-making violence are always spectrally conflated. Law enforcement partakes in law destruction and vice versa, the violent destruction of the law posits a new law. So in democratic states, characterized by rationalized administration and institutionalized governance, checks and balances, these mutually codependent acts of violence are not anymore traceable to a sovereign decision of a king or absolute authority, but delocalized and amplified into an almost spectral web of often anonymous Gewalten, authorities, which act on both extremes of mythic violence, law-making and law-preserving Gewalt. In modern democratic states, a sequence of politics, policy, and policy is indicative not only for etymological reasons. If the Polizeigewalt, violence of the police, in democracies, as Benjamin says, bears witness to the greatest conceivable degeneration of violence, there is no way back to seemingly authentic, sovereign violence as an unalloyed lawmaking violence. Of course, this way back to this kind of sovereign violence and the purity of which is the fantasy of fascism, it's the fantasy of culture. This is the whole idea. And that's why Benjamin's essay can be actually seen as proving the impossibility of going to the fantasy, to the right-wing or conservative fantasy of some pure sovereign violence that would not intervene or would not fall into the degenerative circle of democratic police violence, where it's not clear who is in charge. Everybody, you call the police should actually reinstitute something that you had seen as violent before, but the police, in its very application, in preserving the law, erects a new law. So, and there is no end to it. So, and of course, this calls for more police, and of course, we know this is the logic of the police state, the security state, and this is not alien to democracies, but it is the problem of democracies or any kind of society that cannot relate itself to some kind of God-given sovereign, which is the fantasy, of course, of the fascists who want that one figure that has the kind of sovereign, exceptional violence that can decide. So the symptomatic impurity of mythic violence affects the limits of critique, obviously. In certain spaces of the social order, mythic violence has become almost invisible, an intangible juridical web of biopolitical practices, whereas in other spaces, excessive lawmaking violence is exercised in the guise of law preservation, be it external, you can say as military intervention, or internal as militarization of the police force. With regard to colonial and imperial violence, this spectral conflation which Benjamin detected in the case of the police is projected on a global scale. While mythic violence is distributed internally between different spaces and regions within the social order of one particular state, it is exchanged externally between capitalist states. Under these conditions, under the conditions of the capitalist world market, these asymmetric exchanges follow a colonialist and imperialist logic. Former colonial states outsource lawmaking violence into the post-colonial periphery, while at the same time formerly colonial lawmaking violence is integrated into the means of law preservation of so-called Western-style democracies. So colonialism is coming, the colonial violence against certain groups of people. So the most graphic cases of the inflationary redistribution and transformation of mythic violence can be found in territories where exceptional martial law is permanently imposed on civilians, particularly in territories where the roles of the military and the police symptomatically overlap. I mean, classic case, laboratory of which occupied territories, Palestine, no? It's very clear case, where you have precisely martial law imposed on civilians. In the uneven continuum of violence and counter-violence, strike and counter-strike, terror and counter-terror, the basic asymmetry of violent relations is of course occluded. These extreme cases of violence demonstrate a general tendency inherent to all forms of mythic violence. Also in legal zones that appear less violent, where police and military forces are legally separated and their actions are ready for the public, the spurious dialectics of mythic violence affects all social relations inscribed in the law. I know I'm running a little bit over time. Now comes the section on Benjamin's solution to this. I mean, there is no real solution. Maybe I will very quickly say something on the Benjamin's politics of pure means. So as a strategy against mythic violence and precisely against the cycle, like you cannot really distinguish between lawmaking and law preserving violence. The police is not the exception to this, but exposes the very problem of that. So actually, Derrida didn't say anything new when he said, yeah, both contaminate each other, lawmaking and law preserving violence. That's the whole problem, the point of Benjamin's essay. So as a strategy against mystic violence, be it state-sponsored or non-statal, Benjamin introduces the term pure means, or reines Mittel. Invoking a paradoxical non-violent violence as pure means, his essay explores the possibility of violence that lies absolutely outside or beyond the law. It is not by accident that the term pure means implicitly makes reference to Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, the critique of power of judgment. Kant's notion of the Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck, or purposiveness without purpose, is, according to Marcuse, one of the most advanced concepts of the third critique, which have not yet been explored in their truly revolutionary significance. Actually, this is a quote from Marcuse from Counterrevolution and Revolt. In contrast to Kant, however, Benjamin's version of Kant's purposiveness without purpose is not limited to the realm of aesthetics. The concept of pure means also refers to the sides of language and politics, articulating their inner non-instrumental relation. In the political arena, the realm of pure means can be found in class struggle. Benjamin refers here to earlier mentioned Sorel and his anarcho-syndicalist distinction between the political and the proletarian general strike. Very simple, political general strike is mythic violence, is violence because it is instrumental, because it is premised on conditions under which it's basically kind of a violence that goes with a kind of blackmail. I do this if you do not that, and so on. While the proletarian or revolutionary general strike is just aimed at the state, to destroy the state, meaning unconditional. Unconditional and blurs its very purpose. So it has a purposiveness directed beyond the state without a purpose, without saying, I want to do this for that. Therefore, it is non-violent. So Benjamin has no essential understanding of violence. Violence defies the very fantasy of predicative logic. Like violence is X, Y, Z. No, violence is something which is violent to standing in a relation. I do this, I put the knife on your throat and you give me this. Or I deprive you of your wage, salary, and you have to work for me, something like this. This is violence. So against socialist reformism and idealist utopianism, Benjamin joins here Sorel's attempt to think politics beyond the paradigm of the state, beyond the paradigm of blackmail, if you want. Without this paradigm shift, the striking workers would only witness, this is quote Sorel, that Benjamin also quotes, how the state would lose nothing of its strength, how the transmission of power from one privileged class to another would take place, and how the mass of the producers would merely change their masters. End of quote. It takes this quote fully in critical violence. Against the mythic violence of the state and legal violence, Benjamin invokes, and we heard about the term göttliche Gewalt, divine violence, a speculative term that still inspires commentaries and controversies on his essay. Commenting on Benjamin's use of theological language such as guilt, fate, sacrifice, mythic, and divine, Marcuse, in a short preface to the text in 1964, wrote that Benjamin has indeed proposed formulations that we find difficult to accept any longer. However, structurally, Marcuse supports the argument of critique of violence and reads it in the context of Benjamin's elsewhere documented references to messianic thought. I quote here, Marcuse, in Benjamin's critique of violence, it becomes clear that messianism is a trope that expresses the historical truth. Liberated humanity is only conceivable now as the radical and not merely the determinate negation of the given circumstance. It is the totalizing social political reality of capitalism itself that is reflected in Benjamin's theological references. The theology here has no positive meaning like in political theology, but has a corrective function ex negativo. A radical critique of state violence cannot count on any given roots of criticism. Rather, it also needs to introduce categories that are uncountable and unaccounted for in a certain society at a certain time. But with the rise of political theology after 1979 and 1990, post-secular turn if you want, we can actually question whether Benjamin's language of 1921 is still valid and makes sense, especially in its theological references. That's why we might agree with Marcuse in 1964, what he wrote. Benjamin's messianism has nothing to do with customary religiosity. Guilt and restitution are for him sociological categories. Sociological, you might say, is maybe call them political categories. Society defines destiny and it is itself derelict. Within a person within such a society, a person must become guilty. And of course, guilt, divine, divinity are here not categories of theology. In the absence of prescriptive definitions, Benjamin abstains from identifying divine violence directly with political pure means like a proletarian general strike. Despite its theological charged name, divine violence functions as a non-totalizable distinction in order to introduce an asymmetric negation into the infinite chain of mythic violence as a sequence of violent positing and counter-positing. As a depositing or entsetzende violence, it denotes neither a determinate quality nor a predictable event. As he said, for only mythic violence, not divine violence, will be recognized as such. So that despite its name, divine violence is not in its intrusion of some divine power into the human affairs, but a violence that can be embodied or performed or presented by a profane agent or entity. However, as Benjamin warns, it is crucial not to identify divine violence directly with the highest manifestation of pure violence by humans, that is, revolutionary violence as a pure means, as we have heard for general strike. Rather, between divine violence and revolutionary violence, there is a non-violent, there's a kind of a, could say, a relation of asymmetric correspondence. In this sense, divine violence, a paradoxical, violent, non-violent violence, is the theological name for an inaccessible side within society and profane life, which escapes the logic of mythic violence. At least this was the wager of Walter Benjamin in 1921. So despite its speculative ending, and in the absence of concrete answers, Benjamin's dialectical concept of mythic violence proves instructive, particularly when read with and against Frantz Fanon's reflections on violence in The Wretched of the Earth from 1961. The spurious dialectics of mythic violence undermines any political attempt to attain a neutral position vis-à-vis antagonistic forces. The antagonism between forces of repressions and counterforces against repression, between colonial violence and anti-colonial violence, is not symmetric and cannot be represented from a third position independent from those violent relations through which these forces are constituted. It is precisely the inherent ambiguity of the violent as law-preserving and law-making that renders any violent struggle as asymmetric. Asymmetry here is not to be misunderstood as a conceptual lack or deficiency. Rather, as Benjamin's analysis of legal violence as mythic violence demonstrates, violence is most effective when its asymmetric dialectics is occluded. Theory can only grasp this asymmetry when it gives up the fantasy of a neutral, totalizing viewpoint. So the parallactic shift of perspective, allowing for a critique of violence, is itself an intervention into the force field of uneven Gewalten by taking a political decision, and that is a partisan, partial perspective. Of course, John Brown knew that. Thanks for your attention.
And now we are going to the last quarter of the section. First, we will talk about Counterrevolution and Great Refusal against stupidity and the resilience of liberation.
I have a long time talking about counter-revolution since, I believe, 2013, when, because from 2010, it began the Occupy movement, and then 2014 was this revolt about the transportation here in Brazil, and against the World Cup here in Brazil with Dilma. And the left starts to think that this will be the springtime, the Brazilian springtime, but also rose the right movement that led to Dilma impeachment and Bolsonaro's victory in 2018. So I will start with the obvious thing that Marcuse, he wrote in Counterrevolution and Revolt. The Western world has reached a new stage of development. Now the defense of capitalist system requires the organization of counter-revolution at home and abroad. In its extreme manifestations, it practices the horrors of the Nazi regime. Marcuse describes those horrors that happened during the Cold War, especially after '68. Peter described it very well. And in '68 is still remembered as a year of liberation, but reactions to the endeavors for a different and better world were brutal in many cases. And remembering that in Latin America, the first counter-revolution was in Guatemala in the 50s. Then El Salvador, and then the military coup in Brazil in 1964. Marcuse stated, the counter-revolution is largely preventive, and the West world altogether preventive. Here, there is no recent revolution to be undone, and there is none in the offing. And yet, fear of revolution, which creates the common interests, links the various stages and forms of the counter-revolution. It runs the whole gamut from parliamentary democracy, that the policy state, to open dictatorship. Capitalism reorganized itself to meet the threat of a revolution which would be the most radical of all historical revolutions. It would be the first truly world historical revolution. So, for example, here in Brazil, there is this story that for the right movement, that the 1964 code was to get rid of Brazil of the communists, which is not true because there was no perspective of a communist movement to do any kind of revolution in Brazil in 1964. So it's like that, Marcuse said. The primitive counter-revolution can be tracked back to the time when capitalists around the world fought against the Soviet Revolution. Since then, there were more peaceful and normal times, and underneath, counter-revolution is still working through education and culture industry. And there were times with an open counter-revolution with aggressiveness and brutal repression. Totalitarian governments such as National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy are examples of open counter-revolution in the 30s. Critical theory has dealt with authoritarian states since its beginnings. However, in apparently normal times, counter-revolution takes its place. There is an extensive ideological propaganda. It works what Marcuse has called totalitarian democracy. Totalitarian democracy offers almost little space for public participation in decisions. Lobbies of capitalist agents have more access to representatives and rulers than the common citizen. In fact, there is a clique of rats, Marcuse, named the so-called mafia, in the government that rules for its own interest. This concept is similar to that of a facade democracy of Sheldon Wolin, which is democracy only in the name, not in fact. Although Wolin does not talk about rats acting in the government, he calls attention to the privatization of the public space by companies, including institutions as education, healthcare, transport, parks, and even the government. This way, social justice increases as fewer people get more benefits from the state. It is an exclusive society. And the first example of an neoliberal society was in Chile in the 1970s, with the privatization including of the universities, which was really bad for the Chilean society. And there is this voucher policy. So everything you have to do, you need a voucher to get service. So continue. For Marcuse, one dimension of society has a totalitarian democracy government and manipulates its individuals through media, rational technology, and consumerism. Though through these means, especially consumption, individuals feel feel part of society, even though the society is organized against them. The apparent freedom gives them more comfort to act in conformity to the daily oppression. Marcuse said that freedom is a powerful tool for domination. This political frame has demonstrated that it is not sustainable. When underlying and oppressed people revolt against their situation in society, reclaiming recognition and social change, there is a social crisis. Black people, women, LGBTQ movements, landless and indigenous peoples are examples of those who feel excluded from the society. Marcuse recognized the power of the catalyst groups to change society as the workers seem integrated to this oppressive society. In Counterrevolution and Revolt, Marcuse criticizes the organized left because of its petrified Marxism. It seems that the traditional revolutionary left has difficulty to understand economic and social change involved since 1917. That said, it is important to say that Marcuse continues to believe in the primordial role of working class in social revolution, but for him, it's also important to pay attention to other social issues and groups. Left has failed to give a good response to those groups and their issues. Despite the critiques of to the bourgeois democracy, Marcuse said that it is better that kind of democracy than a dictatorship, as it still has some space for revolts and changes. But it also opens space for those who want to close it. Extreme right learned its lesson from the historical fascism. It occupies space in society through media, manipulate consent, making up narratives, conspiracy theories, defending religion and family values, exalting weapons and aggressiveness. Wilhelm Reich and von Penodon were amongst those who tried to explain fascist behavior with psychoanalysis frame. Marcuse has endorsed their analysis while arguing about the election of Richard Nixon in 1972, the historical fate of democracy, of bourgeois democracy. For Marcuse, a society that elected a person like Nixon to power is a safe society. According to Fromm, the individual has a fear of freedom, to be completely free. He or she needs to be part of a group in which he or she finds identity. However, if there is no autonomy for the individual, and if the identity results of a process made outside of the individual, especially by media culture, then many of these groups in society could be false communities. But the regression against advancements of reason and conscience derive from the fear of the individuals to lose what they think are their benefits. They try to exclude the other. In times of economic depression, there is no society, only individuals looking after themselves and their families, as Margaret Thatcher said. Neoliberalism tries to atomize society, diminishing the role of the state to care about the whole society. The defense of everyone to carry a gun for safety instead to have police to do his job. Vouchers for education, for healthcare, for many other things instead of a state social policy. There is a stimulus against solidarity, against the otherness. Inclusion is reverted in exclusion. This can be brought up the most bad feelings of humanity, such as racism, misogyny, xenophobia, LGBTQ phobia, and aggressiveness. Following the model of propaganda by Edward Bernays, Hitler and Goebbels developed the growth of totalitarian states with popular support. The discourse should be simple to everyone understand it. It needs to be repeated on and on. This way, family, religion, and traditional values are in the core of this discourse. For example, Wilhelm Reich said that in many Nazi propagandas, they said that Germany is the mother, and so the Germans should take care about their mother and not be insulted or injured like the Jews do with Germany. So to affirm those values, it needs to have a contraposition to order the enemy. For example, in Nazi Germany, the Jews. In Brazil today, or since 2018, the Workers' Party. All of this propaganda is made up based upon fake news, alternative facts, fake narratives. Technology is a powerful weapon to spread these lies as if they were true. Authorities like church, political leaders and celebrities can give more power to the false ideological and manipulative propaganda. In apparent democratic states, this kind of propaganda is subtle. Cultural industry and media culture encompasses the whole, promoting values that sell. Marcuse criticized the argument of pure tolerance in which the stupid opinion is treated with the same respect as the intelligent one. The misinformed may talk as long as the informed, and propaganda rights along with education, truth with falsehood. This pure toleration of sense and no sense is justified by democratic argument that nobody, neither group nor individual, is in possession of the truth and capable of defining what is right and wrong, good and bad. Marcuse criticized the manipulative media and how people are educated, so he proposes counter-education to respond to the stupidity and the ideological manipulation. Repressive tolerance allows the ideological manipulation, distortion of facts, fake news, and information. Adorno said in a letter that Marcuse had the energy and strong opposition to the mechanisms of stupefaction. Such mechanisms can explain why people turn themselves into rhinoceros. This is this theatrical play by UNESCO where people began to turn into rhinoceros as a symbolism to fascism. So now I begin to talk about stupidity. Carlo Cipolla was an economist, and he published for his friends in the 70s a book about the 5 laws of stupidity. And years later, it was finally published to a large audience. First book was translated into Italian, and then was published in its original version in English. So I will not discuss all the 5 laws, but it's a real thin book. It's very easy to look. But basically, the first law said that, quote, always and inevitably everyone underestimates the number of stupid individuals in circulation, end of quote. He said, we could think the highest number of possible stupid ones, and the real number is even higher. He defines, quote, a stupid person is a person who causes losses to another or to a group of persons, while himself derives no gain and even possibly incurring losses, end of quote. For him, stupidity does not depend on social, racial, gender, economical, cultural, but rather biological factors. This is a problem I have to develop more. But what he suggests is that stupidity it's a kind of genetic thing. And he does that because for him it explains how developed and underdeveloped, rich and poor countries have the same amount of stupid people. So it not depends if one person has doctorate or basic education, they both can be stupid. So women and men, black or white, everyone could be stupid in the same amount. And he makes a graphic showing the difference between intelligent people, stupid people, bandits, and this is why for him, stupid does not have a necessary connection with ignorance. Stupid is not ignorance. Intellectuals as ignorant ones can be stupid or not. For Cipolla, quote, stupid people are dangerous and damaging because reasonable people find it difficult to imagine and understand unreasonable behavior. Stupid people are dangerous. The problem is that you cannot argue with the stupid people. There's no possibility, it's no logical, not reasonable way. Thus it follows the fourth law, which states no stupid people always underestimate the damaging power of stupid individuals. In particular, no stupid people constantly forget that at all times and places and under any circumstances to deal and or associate with stupid people infallibly turns out to be a costly mistake. And then the fifth law states that stupid people are dangerous than bandits. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a priest that died in prison in Nazi Germany. He was arrested because of his critiques to National Socialism doctrine. In prison, he wrote about stupidity, trying to understand why people have behaved with acceptance of the aggressiveness and authoritarian imposition of Nazis. So for Bonhoeffer, stupidity is not a biological, has not a biological origin like Cipolla, but a moral one. And the phony leaders, phony is my, I use this word, needs these stupid people to manipulate and to get into power. So we can think that those who defend family, religion, and other things, what it means that it never stops changing. Public space and public time constitute a democratic public thing, a democratic public good, only to the extent that they are always precarious, and those Democrats who are so sure of themselves as to doubt nothing in their democracy are always democratic worst enemies. End of quote. And another quote, this is consumerism, is itself based on the limitation of maturity through the systemic generation of minority, the industrial dilution of responsibility, or in other words, based on the reign of stupidity, bêtise. And what it so often accompanies it, namely cowardice and viciousness. In his book, he started criticizing what happened in the neoliberalism, economy of carelessness, economy de l'idée on a global scale, founded on a systemic extension of stupidity, which is also, to say, one of submission, infantilization, the regression to a minority. It also seems that the legacy of 20th century thought is simply to leave the human beings to the 21st century totally defenseless and armed in the face of a situation that appears hopeless and occult. So I will not go deeper in this analysis, but I will try to make some thoughts about that, about this. Horkheimer and Adorno, in Dialectics of Enlightenment, showed the failure of enlightenment that could reverse in darkness a regression of reason. They showed that Bacon had seen this problem of stupidity years, centuries before. Quote, Bacon, looked down on the masters of tradition, the great reputed authors, who first believed that others know that which they know not, and after themselves know that which they know not. But indeed, facility to believe, impatience to doubt, temerity to answer, glory to know, doubt to contradict, and to gain, sloth to search, seeking things in words, resting in part of nature. These and the like have been the things which have forbidden the happy match between the mind of man and nature of things, and so on the road a match may be, it is not hard to consider. So unlike Socrates, who knows that he does not know anything, a stupid person states that they know, now that they know what they do not know. The regressive reason as technological rationality or instrumental reason creates the appearance of a rational society, which with this eclipse of objective reason, people look for their lives, most of them following their own interests and in times of need without caring about the other. For Horkheimer, there is a negative guillotine in which those who suffer the oppression wants not a better life anymore, but that others have the same suffering as they are living. The resentment was appropriated through history to manipulate the vast majority of society, the poor people, the workers. The resented people became against the other when they think the other has benefits that they don't have, when they feel they are losing the little they have. So if it appears one phony leader that dictates what they have to do, they comply. Such phony leaders are politicians, church priests, celebrities, among others. It seems they want to be that these resented people want to be manipulated consciously or not, especially when they hear what they okay. Pode ser que posso falar mais. Mas eu já. Well, It seems that these resentment people want to be manipulated consciously or not, especially when they hear what they already believe. This way, conspiracy theories can be spread. So people want to hear what they think they already know. For example, some of these conspiracy theories, there is one, the last one is said that Lula has died after the election and there is a doppelganger with a mask. The same thing that they say about Paul McCartney and about Bolsonaro in the first days of the result of elections. Now, Bolsonaro is crying. Oh, it's not Bolsonaro, it's a doppelganger that's crying. And these Bolsonarians blocking the roads, we start to pray for a tire, a truck tire. There's a lot of other examples, but time does not. So technological means make no difference. No, make the difference today to old ways of manipulation. For social networks, polemics are good because they sell. The users of social networks become commodities. The examples could be the examples that I gave of Lula as a doppelganger could be hilarious, but they are dangerous, as people could draw weapons and kill people. Like pandemic have shown how a government doing nothing can kill people. More than 60,000 people, 100,000 people in Brazil. And so it's funny, but it's dangerous, like Cipolla stated. As said, ignorant and intellectual persons could be stupid. And Stigler, including mentioned as an intellectual that could be stupid, the citizen hyper. So these peoples are very conservative, hypocrites at different levels of morals. And I want to finish saying that, because I don't have time, saying that on the other hand, and this is the way of hope, the perspective of utopia, there are always revolt, and young generations are doing these revolts. And in the 21st century, we have seen a lot of young people like Greta Thunberg, Malala, and indigenous people like Chai Sului here in Brazil, and a lot of young people trying to defend new ways of confidence between people, no, among people. They want a new conscience about these relations, like the recognition of LGBTQ community, of black people, like what happened in the Black Lives Matter movement, and about the domestic violence against women, against what happened in US of Roe and Wade legislation getting back. So I will have more to say, but I would like to end with this quotation of Marcuse that said about these young generations. He said, the outcome against counter-revolution, the outcome depends to a great extent on the ability of the young generation not to drop out and not to accommodate, but to learn how to regroup after defeat, how to develop with the new sensibility and new rationality to sustain the longer process of education, the indispensable prerequisite for the transition to large-scale political action. For the next revolution will be the concern of generations, and the final crisis of capitalism may take all but a century. So, for Marcuse, revolution is a process which depends on the consciousness and on the rationality. So, if the reason is still in prison, like technological rationality or instrumental reason, for human and nature to be emancipated, it's also reason needs to be emancipated. As Marcuse posits on Earth and Civilization about libidinal reason, erotic reason, sensible reason, we should strive also for this, against this whole stupidity that world may be come. That's it.
We have a little time because today we have to take this room and the training for the auditorium, the last section. Then we have less time. So go directly for the question.
Sami, it was very interesting, but I have this question about violence, about the banalization of violence today. For example, we have this World Cup at Qatar, and people criticize that the country is misogynist, the way they treat women there. They are against the LGBTQ community. They don't accept the rainbow. More than hundreds of thousands of laborers died building these stadiums in a system they called Calafa, a modern slavery. So this is an example, because when the football match started, people forget all of this, they don't care. And the same thing will probably happen in Arabia Saudita in 2030. And the same thing happened in Russia in 2018. So this is one thing, and there is another example of this banalization of violence in different contexts. But we live in a kind of society that violence, this is nothing, so you don't care, unless something like, for example, what happened to Eric Garner in New York in 2014, and
George Floyd, that people said, "Oh, it's enough. We don't accept this violence anymore." I don't know. I would like to know about what you think about this banalization of violence.
For 2 months, less. I have a question for all of you on Benjamin. First of all, you promoted the 1920 book on violence, and do you see a difference between his 1940 book about historical theses, which were published by Herbert? Is there a change in his view on violence? In the 1920 book, he wrote about the positive law and the natural, when I remember it right. So, and then in 1940, I think he was much more negative in his interpretation of violence. What would both of you say? Is there a change between the 1920 book and his thought on violence and the 1940 book? And the second question on Sam is, what do you think about Sorel's political, I would say, flip-flops? And does it have something to do with his view on violence? It doesn't matter where violence happens. In Russia, he was in Russia then, and on the other hand, some of the Nazis and fascism ideologies celebrated his idea of violence. What would you say about it? Was it just a bad interpretation, or is it deepened in Sorel's idea of violence?
The banalization, have you ever?
No, okay, sorry.
Banalization of violence.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it's violence, but the examples that you were highlighting only shows the, let's say, political economy of affect and attention when what pops up, and how then these acts of violence become PR problems. Otherwise, I don't know what should I comment on that. You all know that Qatar is part of American so-called security architecture. It's only a problem because through the World Championship, there were some highlights of highlights of violence. You know the concept of, for instance, Judith Butler, uncreatable life, which develops from Benjamin actually. It's clear that the people who were killed are uncreatable life from the perspective of violence / power. But I don't have a theory of the banality, or I don't have a theory of the untheorizability of violence. I have to look at those cases, and I can really see the power construction there. That's why I agree maybe with what you said about the stupidity. Stupidity what that enables such violent relations. But I think theoretically we don't win anything by that. The first term was ideology. Ideology, stupid people do something without gaining but endangering and threatening the collective or people beyond them, sure. But an intellectual, I think it's not something I can, you also said, it's not an intellectual problem, it's a problem of power structures. I don't like questions that go positive or negative, pessimist or optimist. I think it's not dialectical, and I think what I think about it doesn't contribute anything to any argument. That's why I can't answer that. But I know for sure that Benjamin changed his view from 1925 to 1940 many times, always according to what was the political situation. That's why none of us, I think, is interested in reifying Benjamin as a kind of a political oracle that could be used as a machine of quotation. And for every occasion of the day, you have a suitable Benjamin quotation. I think in the cultural industry of the art and cultural studies, Benjamin has become a figure, unfortunately. Of course, we don't support that, but I would need to know if there is no point in saying, did he change his position towards violence? And of course, he criticized both positive law and natural law, but at least in positive law, he found a dialectical, leverage to get into the argument. The early 1920 essay, 21 essay. Later on, he actually dismissed this entire post-country project of the political violence, at least this what we know through his former friend. The name that I just forget at the moment, but one of his youth friends was Prince Scholler, and he dismissed it and said, justice what helps in class struggle, about 1934. But again, throwing these decontextualized phrases at each other doesn't produce any argument, and certainly not what I think about it doesn't further help the argument.
Well, regarding the question about whether Benjamin changed his point of view from the 20s to the 40s, I would like to observe that he wrote the Baroque tragic drama from 1916 to 1926, no, 25, I guess. So it's more or less the same years in which he wrote the essay toward a critic of violence. And in the Baroque German drama, he developed a certain theory about sovereign power in regard to the Trauerspiel characterization. And in this work, I think it's very interesting to observe his conception about the emergency state or the exceptional state, which is a prerogative of the sovereign regarding to the 17th century. And in the thesis on the concept of history in 1940, he again mentions the emergency state. And in the thesis, he observes that the real state of emergency would be the solution to interrupt the continuum of naturalized violence. So I guess even though he changed some of his opinions and positions considering the different political situations, I think there are some ideas that remain more or less the same. We can observe in the thesis of the concept of history the mixture of theological and political elements, which is of course very controversial, but in the thesis it's an important element to be considered. And so, answering your question, I would say that regarding the appreciation of violence, his idea was more or less, his ideas didn't change radically, because he will defend the necessity to interrupt the cycle or this continuous of nature history, which is a mixture, a way that he understood history as a naturalized process. And so I think the role of the materialistic historian would be precisely to explode this continuum, and so I guess he is kind of defending sort of revolutionary violence. That's it.
Unfortunately, it's not possible more than that. But we had the coffee break to continue this debate. Thank you all. 14:20, short for 10 for 5, 20 minutes for coffee break. Okay.